back at the beginning of docent training when this was all new, and now you're like, oh yeah, I do this all the time, right? You own this place. And it feels really different, right? So usually this is the last one, right? So we had some ecology to make some context at the beginning, and then you learn all these things, you know, birds and plants and trees and rocks and mammals you'll get to next time, but like insects, right? And how to tell other people about them. And then, you know, here we kind of like bring it all back together again, right? Because it's all knitted together in the ecosystem, and they all depend on each other. And at this point, really like to bring the people in too, right? How people are interacting with all these things. So anyhow, Ecology II. So in Ecology I, we're talking about the scientific study of homes being the general idea of ecology. And we're going to expand that a little more, put ourselves in that. But I like this quote. Everyone likes this quote from John Muir, right? When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this is a kind of a game you can play with yourself and with kids and with other people, is how things are connected. And you can, you know, find the links between things, right? Like how are you connected to a hawk? Well, hawks eat gophers, and I tripped in a gopher mound recently, okay? Right, and you can do it with anything. You can actually like pick anything in your system, and you can find the links between them, two things, right? One of them can be you, or it could be two other things, and you can always make a path. So that's a fun thing to do in the park when you're here. Let me see if I got okay. So one of the ways that we see that things are connected to each other is through their adaptations in response to each other. So here we have, you know, an oak twig, right, and it has these two leaves. And did you learn in botany about that? Anything about oak leaves and the shapes, or the what was it?
Like the shoot ends of the leaves like are used to collect the dew or like the water. So they don't fall directly at the trunk of the tree, but like around the tree.
So that, right, the shape channels the water. So it's interacting with the amount of water. The shape maybe responds also to the dryness, right? That they don't, that the small hard leaves don't dry out as fast, right? So they're, the little spines maybe deter animals from browsing, from eating the leaves, right? To slow down the amount that animals eat the leaves. So even when you look at the plant leaves, you see the trace of the interaction over time. And the way that interaction changes over time we call adaptation, right? The response being kind of nailed down genetically. So the adaptations are genetic traits that help something fit into its environment. It's another one of these cases where biology has a very specific meaning for something, and in everyday language, adaptation or adaptability is used more casually, right? Like, you know, we adapt to the circumstances, right? Somebody is more adaptable at work than someone else maybe, right? And that's not a genetic trait, that's just that they're responding, you know, in real time to the conditions. But biologically, adaptations are defined as these genetic traits. Yes?
So did the tooth leaf also evolve in other environments that are very similar to our Mediterranean environment? So if you go in Europe, do you see tooth leaves as well?
Yes, you do. You see remarkably similar shapes of plants in Mediterranean climates. Yep. Even places that are very, very far away, like South Africa. Okay, so here's another thing, lives in the park. You've probably seen them around, right? The acorn woodpeckers. they have a bunch of adaptations that to their environment, right? That they have coloration, right? That matches where they on part of their body, but they also have signaling coloration, right? Which lets them communicate with others in their environment, right? Like here I am, I'm bright red, right? They have a beak that's shaped to their food source, right? They have feet that are well suited to where they live. So every biological thing in the diversity of life has some history of being shaped by interactions. Not every single biological feature of everything is necessarily, traceable to an obvious interaction, but in general, right, the adaptations are the ways that organisms fit in, right, connect to the whole system. So to just, it's funny because when I started teaching this, we approached evolution very carefully, and we kind of talked about, we have to be careful how we talk to kids about evolution because, people could be really reactive to the idea of evolution, which is now much less of an issue than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Right now we have new things that people get upset about. And so, but, so I just want to, quickly reinforce what evolution actually is, which is the change in genetic traits of an organism over generations, right? And it can be driven by different things. It can be caused by, mutations. It can be caused by interactions in the environment selecting for some individuals over others. It can be caused by just kind of random survival of some individuals instead of others. So this is a very well studied system of guppies with spots, right? And if you've ever had guppies, or if you've known anyone who had guppies, you get a lot of generations of guppies really fast, right? So guppies are a good system for humans to study evolution in because they're fast. They change fast over because they have a lot of generations in one of our generations, right? So we can observe evolution in them. So in this case, a series of little pools, like this is like a little ponds connected by streams, and some of the pools, some have big predators in them, and some have small predators in them, right? Like this one. The bigger the predator's eye, right? Like, see, this one has a big eye. The more easily they see their prey, or the more clued in to visual signals they are. So so there are also guppies with different numbers of spots, right? So there are more plain guppies like this one, and fancier guppies like this one. So in this series of pools, scientists studied what was naturally there, and they also did some manipulations where they took some predatory fish out of pools and put some in pools, and over decades of time, and found, I forget which way this goes, found this. So this is an actual picture of what these pools look like, which looks like not at all a bad place to do your research, right? and over here is spots per fish, the number of spots on each fish. Okay, and this is over months, but you get a lot of generations of guppies over months. And where there were no predators, or few predators that were not especially visual predators, right, which are these two up here, the guppies, in a year end up with more spots on average. And where there are lots of visual predators, they end up with fewer spots. Right? So that seems kind of like that fits with the way, like this, the way we imagine it, right? So we can see that's evolution of this population over generations, because the number of spots is genetically fixed, and that was, determined separately outside of this experiment, right? That the number of spots they have, that's a genetic trait that they pass on to their offspring. Just that where there's high predation, more of the guppies that are plain survive. So more of those have offspring. And where there's low predation, right, the ones with lots of spots that are beautiful and attractive to the females are more successful and have more offspring. See? So it's really about who has more offspring over time. Yes?
So I was confused by that because I was imagining that those spots led the predator pike, which had a bunch of spots on it, to believe that it was not something we should go after. I
Oh.
was almost looking at the opposite, is that the predation thing said that you got a bunch of pike out there going to eat you, and if you don't have spots on you, it's going to eat you because you don't look mean and nasty.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so if you were the predator, it would come out differently. And that, right? And that's an interesting other, way that, and it just says that it's not like there isn't some predetermined path, like guppies are going towards some perfection of spottedness or not. It depends on their interactions and how that leads to the selection of future generations. That was beautifully illustrated. You thought the same thing?
I thought too, because also the coloration, everything looked like the blue looked more like the killfish,
Uh-huh.
and the lighter one looked more like the cichlid. So I was wondering what their fry looked like.
Oh.
Maybe it looks they didn't evolve to have spots because they're mimicry. I mean, that's just.
Yeah, it's just another possibility, right? So just in this case, it was so simple, like, can I see it or not? Right, like, can I see it? Yes, you should go there. Okay, so we see lots of close associations. Try to find some examples here in the park of really close associations between species that have evolved over time. And so this thing is dodder. It's a parasitic plant. In some years there's a lot of it around, and some years there's not very much. But it's a parasite on other plants, and it's actually able to sense how nutrient-rich the other plants are, at least in experiments in greenhouses where they had pots that were of other plants that were well fertilized and ones that weren't, that the dodder was able to selectively parasitize the better fed plants, the healthier plants. Anyhow, this is a very close kind of association we call a symbiosis, but this one is called parasitism, right? So this is a parasite. That just means a really close association between two species where one partner benefits and the other one is harmed, right? So another kind of symbiosis is mutualism, where two partners both benefit from this very close partnership that they have. So these are yucca plants, and this is an example that we have actually illustrated out in the museum, in the interpretive center next door, that yucca moths require yucca flowers to reproduce. And the yucca flowers benefit from the pollination. And it's a very close association where the yucca plants do need a pollinator, and this is the best pollinator. And the yucca moths need yucca plants. So that's another mutualism. Here's another mutualism. My point is that mutualisms are more common, but parasitism is also pretty common. These are lichens. You probably have seen lichens out. Yes, lichens out on the trails. And lichens are an association between algae, bacteria, and fungi that live intertwined with each other. So most of the structure of it is fungus, but between the fibers of the fungus are algal cells and bacterial cells and they do photosynthesis, and the algal cells anyway. And the lichen provides structure and also delays the drying out. So if there were just the algal cells on the surface of a rock, they might, be metabolically active in doing photosynthesis when it was wet and rainy, but they would dry out, as soon as it wasn't. So the lichens also dry out, but they dry out with a kind of preservative effect that keeps them both alive while they're dry, right? Which is kind of like antifreeze, keeps things alive when they're.
So lichen is more like a colony, a symbiotic colony?
Yeah, it's a we call it a hollow organism, HOLO. So it's a hollow biont. It's all the living things together, and actually we're kind of beginning to see that almost everything alive that looks like a whole or one organism to us actually has a lot of other things living with it, right? So like we have, right, bacteria on our surface and inside of our guts that are important to our normal life function. And so, you have actually more bacterial cells than human cells in your body, just that the bacterial cells are much smaller. Right, and that you are, a kind of symbiosis of the bacteria, and probably also some fungi and your, human cells. And if you go around and sample, like almost every living thing now, you can find that they have a microbiome associated with them, which is a bunch of microbes, and that there are characteristics of the organism that are some of which are given by the metabolic products of the microbes, right? So that the microbes affect the shape of things, the digestion, all kinds of stuff. And sometimes they're needed to reproduce. It's amazing and a very active area of research currently.
Sounds like a coral reef.
Yes. This one is really like the reef building corals, where they have organisms that you can isolate, and they can live in the lab separately from each other, but in the wild they can only live together. Yeah.
Janet, I have just to demonstrate my knowledge.
Uh-huh.
Have anybody who've traveled up in Monterey or on the coast, you see something that looks like, they call it Spanish moss? You know what I'm talking about? That's not moss. That's a lichen.
Yeah.
It's called lace lichen, and believe it or not, that is the California state lichen.
Yeah.
It may or may not be on your test.
Okay. Mistletoe is a parasite. It's a partial parasite. It's parasitic for the water, right? So that it draws its water from the tree, but it does its own photosynthesis. So some parasites don't even have, they don't have chlorophyll. They're just they're called, what are they called? Ghost pipes, you see sometimes in the forest, that are totally white little plants, and they're completely parasitic and don't do any photosynthesis. But the mistletoe draws water from the tree, but does its own photosynthesis, doesn't draw like sugar or food from the tree. Mostly they don't really hurt the tree, as my understanding, that they don't have a huge negative effect. And the birds like them. Okay. All right, so here's another kind of, interaction, right here. Like, why would this plant make these bright red berries? Right, it's holly leaf cherry. So it's like, why would it, we just feel like, okay, that's what they do. But, right, but they're so bright and they're so big and they have fruit on them. Yeah.
Maybe to attract an animal to eat it.
To attract an animal to eat it, right? So that's a communication between the plant and an animal, right? Like you see the coyote scat full of cherry pits out there on the path, right? And birds eat them. That it's the plant, interacting with, figuring out, right, through interactions over many generations that, this is a good way to reproduce. This is successful, right? Successful to signal to animals that here is something to eat that has the seed inside, right? So it's not that the plant is consciously thinking, what can I do to increase my yield of offspring, right? But it's the interaction yields that effect, right? That the interaction of the birds and the coyotes and the people with the holly leaf cherry leads to this adaptation, right? Which kind of benefits them both over time. Okay, so now I want to change and talk a little bit about disturbances because disturbance is a big ecological factor, and it's something that we see happen in the park a lot. Yes.
You got me on that last one, which was there's an implied genetic origin story in which the ones that had more berries somehow survived and grew because they had more berries. Well, what caused more berries? It must have been some genetic disturbance. So I was thinking, is there a big DNA studies going on now for this subject you're discussing to try to figure out why one gets more of something to begin with and then it evolves because it had this strange new feature?
That is a super interesting thing. Is the diversification what causes there to be greater variety, right? So in early evolutionary studies, they, like way back in the 1800s, they just said everything has variation, which is observable, right? Like not, if you counted the cherries on the trees, they would all have different numbers of cherries. And it's not, there is the variation in the number they have, but there's also the difference in the number that survive, right? So the number that survive and reproduce themselves is what leads to what happens evolutionarily, right? To the adaptation. But the variation is super interesting because, we know that when DNA is copied, there are always some mistakes. And we have like systems inside our cells that do some proofreading and fix most of that, but there's always some mistakes that get by. And, and that's shown in, like you say, in lab studies where they, sequence things, weighted generation, sequence them again and again. Or in cell lines, like when they have cancerous cells, in culture, right, and sequence them over and over time. So, yes. But
it's going on right now. Okay, good.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it is the basis, as you get right to the point, right? It's the basis of all the evolution is that there is some variation, right? Like if everything is the same, right, then you don't get any progress, or and life is always diversifying. And and after there is something like a mass extinction, then there's always like a big diversification after, right? There's a force that makes variation. And yeah, it's cool and interesting. Yes? Yeah?
What he said.
Uh-huh.
his question. So, could do we see that after like big events, like we're talking about the next slide, which is like the whole biomass and the disturbances, do we see then after things like that more diversity?
Depends.
Like I was just wondering if that triggers the evolutionary response to try to diversify.
I think things are always, there is an underlying push to diversify, but sometimes when there are spaces, right, like after a mass extinction where many, many species are gone, then maybe more things survive that wouldn't have in a more crowded ecosystem. But on this human scale of observable disturbances, it's a lot less clear because there's a lot of other stuff happening, which I'll talk about right here. What? You're looking for a mass extinction?
No, I said it must be tough to do an experiment with a mass extinction.
I hate to, we're in a mass extinction right now. That the rate of species loss right now is as fast as during any previous mass extinction. Looks like this, right? You get this idea like a mass extinction looks like dinosaurs stumbling through the snow in the nuclear winter, right? And it's not. It looks like this because when you see those like the history of the life on Earth with these really steep like mass extinctions, right? With like the number of species and it plummets, right? That's the whole history of life on Earth compressed to a little graph, right? It's like geological time scale. But in fact, if you spread that out to like a human time scale, it looks like this. Yeah, it's a sobering thought, but it's, that, we are actually losing species that fast right now. So if you want to do an experiment in a mass extinction, this is the time. Okay.
We got you off the track.
Very interesting, though. Okay, so disturbances are anything that causes a loss of biomass. So this is not like on the scale of the whole planet or the whole history of Earth, but this is like, here in the park, right? We have, we could have, or, kind of human scale, right? We have pulse disturbances, which are like a fire burns through here, which happens, pretty often. And then it recovers. Usually in about 7 years, you can't tell other than some, char on the oak trees. You can't tell that it's burned, right? That there's a kind of uneven recovery. Sometimes, it could go kind of different if, it burns and then right here it burns again, right? That could have a different outcome. And that's a little more like this, a press disturbance, where conditions change, right? That there's a big loss of biomass, and then it doesn't recover because it never goes back to the original conditions, right? Like in this case, right, fire burns through the park, fire's done, right? And then, right, the ecosystem can start going again. In the case, this is what it looked like we were facing in the drought for 7 years, right? That it became drastically drier, and then it didn't change, right? And now we have rain again, obviously, right? And the big drought is over, but on the scale of 20 or 30 years, right, we're still in a period of low water overall, or a period of warmer summers than we used to be, right? Yes?
I'm curious how pollution fits in. Could it be both depending on the situation?
Absolutely, yeah. Could be either, right? Like, so if it was like somebody spilled their weed killer concentrate right up in the neighborhood up there and it ran down the creek here, right? That would be a pulse because it would run down, it would be gone. Right, but if there was something leaching out over time, right, that was, or something more permanent, or like radioactivity with a long half-life, then, you know, it would not dissipate, right? So it's important to think about, when you're thinking about recovery, like how the system recovers, whether the disturbance that took away some biomass was a pulse or a press, right? That a press disturbance, it doesn't stop. It's just like a change in the system. So, you know, climate change in our, you know, the scale of our lifetimes, right? It is warmer and more variable. It just is, and it's not going to reverse in the time of our lifetime. Yes?
I was reading that the job's not over, that we need 2 or 3 more of these kind of seasons
Yeah.
because of the larger lakes that they still needs to fill up more. So it might be a pulse disturbance even though we've had a record number of rainfall.
Yes. Yes, because also the groundwater is not recharged, like that we take more groundwater out than gets down into the ground, especially in agricultural areas. Yeah, so that's why people are still fighting, even in this year with this record rain, fighting about rights to the Colorado River, like right now. Okay, so there are also these ecological ideas of resistance and resilience, right? Resistance is not being affected by something, right? The fire goes through, the oak tree doesn't burn, it's fire resistant, right? The fire goes through, the chaparral burns, but then it grows back. It's resilient, right? Bounces back, right? So those are, again, like resistant and resilient. They're words that have a specific meaning in ecology, but in this case, it's a lot closer to the way that we would use it in everyday language. These are, 2 different ways of surviving the same problem, right? And we have examples of plants here in the park who respond in either of these ways to a fire. Okay, now I'm going to switch a little to talk about the creek. And obviously this isn't this year's creek because it's not roaring, right? It's just a little trickle of creek there. Oh, no, I'm not. First I'm going to talk about people and the creek. That was, the wrong transition spot. So this graph, I always like to show this graph because it looks like an empty graph. It looks like they haven't put the data on it yet, right? But then you see that the data goes along the bottom and right up this side. And this is the human population on Earth. Over, so, right, this is 2025 here, right? 1,000 years ago, just here, right? And there were the early humans over there were maybe not Homo sapiens, right? Over there at 2 to 5 million years ago, but something like us or a progenitor of us, right? And then there's a break, right, from millions of years ago to thousands of years before the current era. So maybe, 9,000 years ago. Okay, but even the times when lots and lots, when the population of humans crashed, right, like during the Black Plague, it's this right here, right, which was about 1/3 of the global population was lost in that plague. And, which was like if this hadn't happened, that was like a big event in human history, right? But you see what's happened since then, right, is that the human population has taken off exponentially, and we are now at 8 billion people. And that can't, it is not possible for this many relatively large animals to not have an effect, right? There's almost no way that you could have this many of anything, right? If it were, you know, mountain lions or, right? You couldn't have the ecosystem not be affected, right? So we have to think about that, right? To put ourselves in the picture of this ecosystem, right? This is like a press disturbance, right? This is a change in the ecosystem that is not going to just, you know, burn through and go away, right? So turning that around, right, from the number of humans to like the effect of humans, that the Earth today withstands at least 100,000 times the human impact on it as it did 5,000 years before the current era, just because of the change in the number of people, right? That means the same impact in 5 years that people use, I mean, in 5 minutes that people used to have in a year. And the same impact in a year as ancestors had in 100,000 years, right? That's just like sort of flipping the ratios of all those things, right? But it makes you think that, you know, you, as humans, have an incredibly powerful effect in ecosystems. So one way to measure that is through something called an ecological footprint, which is an estimator based on people's, based on what you choose to do in the ecosystem of your effect, right? So, excuse me, I know that's being recorded, it's going to make a mess. And it's an attempt to make that normalized to the surface of the Earth, or how much of the surface of the Earth is needed to support someone's way of life. So, you know, it's not exact, it's an estimation. Here's a calculator of that, footprintcalculator.org. You can go there, this is your homework, estimate based on, it's going to ask you questions like about how much you travel and what do you eat and how big a place do you live in and stuff like that. And also what country you live in, because there are some costs to living in your country, right, that, you know, we pay indirectly through taxes and things like that, right? So that's a way to start to think about how, you know, what choices we make, which are like totally everyday choices here, you know, in our lives in California, affect the rest of the planet. Oops, over clicking. A way to turn that around, right, because on average we use the resources of equivalent to 1.75 Earths in a year. So globally, right, humans are using the resources that could be regenerated on Earth in 1.75 years, and we're using that in 1 year, every year, right? So if you were doing that with your bank account, right, right, you immediately understand that, right? So, you know, we're doing this by depleting the resources that there are on the Earth, and you know, over time, as you know, if that is a press disturbance that doesn't change, then it'll change the ecosystem's ability to regenerate itself over time. So Earth Overshoot Day is another way of flipping that idea over, right? Of saying so if we use this much, you know, of the Earth's renewable resources in a year, when would we start going into the red, right? we start going into the red with our resources. And that's plotted here over time. And again, it's an estimate. So, this is not necessarily exactly representing what's happening on Earth, because it's hard to measure all those things. But you get the idea that there is a significant trend here, right? That humans are using more resources every year. And so the day you go into the red is becoming earlier and earlier in the year, right? So if we can switch it around to a personal finance kind of metaphor, it's easy to see that, we're depleting things faster every year. So another thing you can do with an ecological footprint calculator is to just look at what's the average, say the average, resource use for the average American, right? Because we live in a big country, we drive a lot, we travel a lot, we're mostly wealthy on the global scale, right? Not universally, just on average, right? Like, not everybody in America is driving and flying all the time, but on average, if everybody lived on Earth, all the 8 billion people lived like the average American, that Earth overshoot day, the day when we have used up all the renewable resources, right, that are produced that year, would be March 13th, which is yesterday. And it feels to me like this year just started, right? So, because we're wealthy, we have a lot of leverage, right? So our choices have a lot of impact, right? So, and we all don't like, when I teach this at CSUN, my students go, I'm not wealthy. But globally you are, pretty much. Not everybody, but, on average, you're doing okay. And, so you can think about the fact that your choices have a lot of effect and leverage, right? That you can, push the global equation more than somebody who has less resources. So, embrace your power. Yes?
I'm curious about the way that this is calculated, because to me, if I think of overdrawing a bank account, that's possible because of the way that the bank is we have this invisible money that's, digital.
Uh-huh.
But there's not an invisible digital earth. So is there anyone doing the calculation where it's more on the right-hand side, there's 100% of our resources that have been used up and we're working toward that, but the 1.75 to me makes it confusing. I don't know if that makes sense. Because we don't have two Earths.
No, we don't.
So is there anyone doing the calculation where they're showing us percentage-wise, how much till we get to the point of almost 100% we've used everything up?
Yeah, it's a little complicated because, yes, they are, and it actually comes from that estimation. So it would be 1 over that, not quite 1/2, but and that is it's if you think of there was X amount of forest, and now there's less, right? So there's still forest growing. Right, so there's some positive factor that goes into how much forest, but there is also forest being depleted, right? So the balance is a negative number, right? But yeah, there are people trying to estimate all these things, or how much we can actually reverse it. Is it even possible to reverse it? And it's complicated because it's balancing all these different demands, right? That people need things. And, we think a lot about animal welfare, but there's also human welfare. And that's the kind of things the choices, right, that have to be made. So it is, yes, go ahead.
Well, I'm just looking at 2019, for example.
Uh-huh.
And that would be the entire 8 billion people
Yes.
combined.
Yeah,
But
on
if you-
average, yeah,
On average.
yeah.
But on average, in the US, we use a lot more than that.
Yes. Yes, so like if the average is, the middle of a big range, like, yeah, we don't use quite the most per person, but of any country, but really close. Like we're in the top like 4.
So
Yeah.
there are lots of other people that are way down in terms of their,
Yeah.
in other regions of the
Yes.
planet.
Yeah, and if you go to one of these, the websites like this one, Earth Overshoot Day website, they show this data in all kinds of different ways. And one of the ways is a big circle, which is like the year, and when in the year each country reaches its overshoot day. And the U.S. is pretty close, like, is this, early in the year. And then, other countries that go almost around the year. I think Jamaica was the one where the average person gets, uses the least resources over the year.
To make sure I'm clear, I think your chart says that what the actual estimate of resource usage given the variation around the world is, and then your comment.
Yeah, it's just about the
extends
U.S.
just United States behaviors to everybody in the
Mm-hmm.
world to draw it down. Because I was a little confused for a second thinking that, well, after 2019, I would expect that it would have gone down again because of the pandemic and nobody traveling and, everything that was going on.
It does.
Gas prices and things like that.
It-
It should have gotten better.
It does. It goes like down like this, a little bit. And actually this next graph will show you something else that happened too. But yeah, 2020, people used less resources, and then it kind of picked up again. So as people came back around. So one of the ways that we're changing the ecosystem and an outcome of our resource use, especially using fuel, burning fuel, and also producing things that rot and produce methane, is making greenhouse gases, right? Which you have certainly heard about other places. This isn't the first time you've heard about greenhouse gases. But changes the climate, right? Changes the atmosphere, and actually the effect of methane is many times greater than the effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in terms of insulating the planet. So having things like waste break down without oxygen, like in a landfill, right, where it's covered up and there's not much oxygen, causes it to break down and produce methane rather than to break down and produce carbon dioxide, right, which is what would happen like as plant material, right, breaks down out here, or in our story that we tell on the board back there, right, in our school program, right, that as things decay, right, then eventually they release their raw materials, including carbon dioxide, right, which went in to photosynthesis, right? Remember way back to the beginning, right, in Ecology I, that plants are always taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and making more plants out of it. And we, in our activities, right, produce carbon dioxide by burning things in addition to our own metabolism, which gives off carbon dioxide, right? And the metabolism of all animals and plants in the dark, right, has a net production of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has this blanketing effect in the atmosphere, keeps our planet nice and temperate compared to Mars, for example. and the right amount, which keeps it, if you have way more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you have something more like Venus, which is really hot on the surface. And we're shifting that atmospheric composition, and that's shifting the effects of the atmosphere, right, on what happens on the surface of the Earth. So this is the monthly global surface air temperature anomalies. So it's, right, you can see it's not actually the temperature, right? It's how much the temperature has changed compared to this time in here. It's usually like 30 years back, right? And you see that, right, in this window, it averages out like 0. And since then, it has almost always been warmer, right? And there's really, not much expectation that that's going to change very much, that it's just going to be warmer. But, there is variation from month to month and year to year, and there are some years where, the temperature changes less. So that is a press change, right? That's not a pulse. It's not like global warming happened and, now everything is adjusting to it. It's something that's continuing, and the whole system is dealing with it, right? Including adjusting the flow of wind and water, right? And causing more variation. Right, that's what's happening with the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. So that's just measuring the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 1959. I think this goes up to 2019. And, steadily increasing. It has variation from, with seasons. Right, so that, there's in the season where there's more photosynthesis happening, it's a little lower, and when there's less, it's a little higher, right? So because most of the land mass is in the northern hemisphere, so in the northern winter, right, there's less carbon dioxide being taken up by plants, and so we get this little variation each year, but it's nothing like the change over time. Okay. And that's just the carbon dioxide and not the methane. You might have been asked already, maybe not, depends on where you live, to separate out your compost at home. Right? You have already?
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's, I think, in July, or June or July.
In June or July, they're switching from waste management companies.
And why? Do you know why? Why are they making you do that?
Maybe they give a crap about the environment.
Maybe they give a crap about the environment is probably why. So why, if you give a crap, why would you do that? Why would you separate your compost out?
When I was teaching English 101 and we taught nonfiction, I taught this amazing book, Garbology.
Oh yeah, it's a great book. Yeah.
How our waste affects the planet, like locally and at a global scale, and how poorly things are run. So right, like you were saying, if landfills create mostly methane, then that's really bad. If we compost stuff and it turns into CO2 instead, then plants can process that better.
Yep. That's the thing. That's the reason. It's to just switch to making your waste produce more CO2 than methane.
And if I could, sorry, just one more thing.
I love that book.
I love teaching this book. So this book is from 2013, so obviously it's 10 years old now. But at that time, the calculations were that all of us in America make about 102 tons of waste in our lifetime. So that stuck with me.
Like, what if you had to carry it around, right? Like, what if you had to store it yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, this is you're thinking about your trash? There's a lot of, yes. So this is a carbon budget model of where the carbon is, right? It's in these different pools, right? Like, so there's CO2 in the atmosphere, and then there's CO2 in the bodies of all kinds of living things, right? Because we're made of, carbon-based organisms, right? We have carbon in us, right? In our molecules. So do all the plants, animals, all the microbes that live in the soil. And there's lots of carbon in limestone and fossil fuels and in the geological parts of the earth and in the shells of dead mollusks, in piles, right? So all of these, everything in the ecosystem pretty much has some carbon in it. There's some CO2 dissolved in water and in seawater, right? So there are all these pools, and it flows between them by the connections in the ecosystem, right? By the activities of things in the ecosystem, right? So, all the living things do respiration, which puts CO2 out into the atmosphere. And when things burn, it breaks down the molecules, it releases CO2 to the atmosphere. And so this is the kind of model that scientists use to think about, where the greenhouse gases are and where they're going, depending on what choices everyone makes, right? So this is a very simplified one from, a textbook, but it gives you the idea that if you, can estimate, the pool of, say, carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean, and then how fast it's moving into other things, right? Then you can construct this big global budget, right? And that's, a huge project, but people are doing it all the time, to estimate, like, if we were to, suppress fires, what effect would that have on the amount of CO2? Or if we were to divert all of our food waste, because we have a lot of food waste, right, to produce CO2 instead of methane, what effect that would have. So this is the kind of mental framework that scientists use to make these estimations.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if I understand this. Up in the upper left-hand corner says reservoir, then process, location, and trophic levels. The color, maybe it's my eyes.
Yeah,
I can't tell the difference between trophic levels and reservoir. What is the trophic levels?
Trophic levels are like producers, which are plants, and consumers that eat plants, right?
So that's rabbit.
And it's this box: producers, consumers, and decomposers.
Okay. And the reservoir is the thing in the top, CO2 in the atmosphere?
Yeah. So, right. And these, right, rocks.
Yeah, it's just the colors are so solid.
Yeah, it is. I get it. So those are, yes, the big pools, and then these other things connected, the purple ones connected by the arrows, are the processes that take carbon from one pool to another. Right. There would also, you could have another one that would be methane in the atmosphere. And you could have also methane underground. Okay. Anyhow, that's the framework. And this is an EPA report from a long time ago. See, 2008. But it makes these predictions, right, based on those kinds of models and what they expect what effects they would expect to have on weather systems in the Southwest, right? And I just highlighted some things. Warming, drying, intensification of droughts, increased variability of rain, less runoff, longer, hotter growing seasons, shift in vegetation patterns, greater droughts. And in 2008, this was already occurring, but accelerating, right? So that's like a prediction made 15 years ago that we can pretty much say from our experience of living here, like, oh yeah, that was pretty right on. Like, this is what we do see all those things happening.
We're taking a break this year, though.
Yes. But no, what we're having though this year is increased variability of rain, right? So we're having years of no rain, years of extreme rain, right? So increased variability. So some people say you shouldn't say global warming because it's not universally warming, because what you're really getting is change, right? So you're getting an intensification of change, right? And you know, if you don't like a boring life, this is good, right? Intensification of change. But you think about, like, you know, it's going to affect everything around us. Okay. And we have to not be despairing about that, about all these things, right? You're like, how? So Rachel Carson, do you know who Rachel Carson is? Right? Rachel Carson wrote some beautiful books about change in the ecosystem that she could observe due to pollution and other things, mostly pollution, in the 1960s, like, you know, way back. And her writing for popular audiences was so influential that it led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. And, you know, the only recent new agency, well, at least at that time, in the federal government. And now there are EPA, you know, branches in every state. They're state EPA offices. But when asked toward the end of her life what, you know, she would do for people, like if she could do anything for people, if she could do anything to help the world, she said that she would do this, that she would give everyone a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life as an unfailing antidote against boredom and disenchantments of later years, sterile preoccupation with things that are artificial, and alienation from the source of our strength. Right? So she was, you know, said you have to find that sense of awe and wonder, right? And that's what will carry you through your challenges, right? And that's part of what we are about here, right? Is, you know, is showing the living world and saying, look at that, you know, look at that thing. And anyhow, this is a place, I want to stop now and take a break, right? Because we really need to have, like, we're expecting to have some donuts or something right now, right? And you're right. So we'll do that without any despair. We'll. So yes.
So when I used to teach this at my college, invariably the students would say, "Well, thanks. Now I'm really depressed."
Yeah, that's why we can't stop there. We got to stop here.
So when you get that comment, how do you respond?
Now they're really depressed?
Yeah.
Then I say you have a lot of leverage. What I showed you is that you have a lot of power in this ecosystem to make it go the way you want, and that, you know, you have to, you know, take that on, accept your power, and go out in the world and feel the awe and do the things you want to see in the world. That's what I say. But it's hard, you know? And they're like, but I got to work 12 hours tomorrow. And yes.
I always like thinking that
About water, because Rachel Carson was all about water pollution, that she was actually a fisheries scientist who started learning about water pollution because her friend was interested in birds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what kinds of things we might find in the stream. If you go in the interpretive center, and here you see that there are, you know, we have a stream bed display with, you know, pretend water and water creatures inside, which are many times bigger than they really are naturally occurring, right? So that they're really big to see. Like if you bend down and look in the stream display in the museum, you'll see, you know, some insects that are like this big or this big, right? They're about 10 times as big as they really are to make them fun and interesting and easy to see from, you know, display distance. When the stream is in normal intermittent stream, well, it's not normal. It's the way the stream used to be. We used to have a lot of aquatic insects in there. Then we had years of drought and we had no stream and no aquatic insects. And then we got the pond, right? So we have the pond that has a lot of aquatic animals of different kinds and aquatic plants, you know, because you helped out, I think. Did you help out, Fred, cleaning the pond? Some of you? Not during class? Okay. Anyhow, the pond is pretty well managed, right? Like it's not, it's like a semi-natural place, but it's managed by people to keep it from just filling in. And, but we can use it to teach a lot of things, right? That I was just looking in the pond yesterday. There are a lot of eggs in there and snails and algae and, you know, and that's just the things you can see with your eye, and little frogs. And in some times of the year there are these, but there are also fish that eat these in the pond, right? But we also find mosquitoes in the stream when it has little pools on the side, like when the water goes down a little bit and we have little eddy pool areas on the side. We'll see tadpoles in there and sometimes dragonfly nymphs and mosquito larvae and all kinds of interesting things, water beetles. So I'm going to include a little bit of information about those things so that, you know, when people show, you know, people you have already seen love to play in the creek. They love to look in the creek. It is just so exciting, right? So not everyone finds this metamorphosis so exciting once you know what it is, but it's really interesting to talk about, right? That they, you know, the mosquitoes, you know, start out as, we don't have a picture here of the raft of eggs, but they spend a lot of time, you know, in this like wriggler stage with a little snorkel that they use to get air from the surface, which is super interesting. Wow. And then they pupate and they hatch out of this pupa right at the surface of the water without getting wet and fly off, which is pretty cool. And then, so that's a complete metamorphosis like butterflies have. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. Here's a dragonfly nymph here. They also have a metamorphosis from being an aquatic insect that lives in the water to being the dragonfly that we are used to seeing. And now, which of these is our stream? Do we have an ephemeral stream, an intermittent stream, or a perennial stream?
Little bit of the first two.
Somewhere in the first two, right? We have, you know, officially have an intermittent stream, right? That it normally, or over, you know, the time that humans have been paying attention to it, that it would flow every wet season. We just have not really had very wet seasons, but we do have some water in there every year that it rains. And then the water continues to flow for, you know, months, often into the summer, as it drains the mountains here. Okay. And the most common and popular animals in there by far are tadpoles. There's usually some green algae there. Whoops, wrong click. Like this. Green algae is not bad or toxic, or, sometimes, kids are like, ew, it's the sea witch's hair, it's gonna get them or anything. It's perfectly normal in small amounts and not toxic to anyone and part of the system. And the tadpoles are delightful, and hopefully we'll have a lot this year. Yes?
Janet, do you recall during the 2020 class, and we walked up the canyon trail a little bit looking in the stream, and we saw these long, very narrow things that looked like worms, and did you say they were worms, water worms?
They're called horsehair worms, and they are parasitic in grasshoppers and crickets and sometimes other animals.
The ones that when you drown them, they come out?
If you drown the grasshopper, yes, they would come. The worms would come out, but they also would just come out at the right stage of their life cycle.
And the host dies?
Yeah, and they are a shockingly big worm for being, oh, cool.
It's right out of the spigot.
Right out of the spigot? Okay. You see anything, see any eggs in there?
Yeah, I couldn't see any pouring rain.
Okay.
You have to stir the whole thing up.
Yeah.
But there's some crud in there.
Crud. All right. So Jim just very kindly went out in the rain to get us some pond water because we have we have so you probably have played with the Discovery boxes at some time or seen some of them. Yes, during docent training. Yes, no, yes, a little bit. We have the stream one. Did you play with that one? The water and stream box. So we'll go through what's in there. So that was our alternative to going for a walk in the rain, is to play with the stuff that's in this box, which is a great activity for a rainy day. So we'll look at some pond water with some microscopes, among other things. Okay, so what's in the stream, the river further down, depends a lot on what's happening up in the streams up here. Even though we don't have any fish in our stream, right? Even in years when it's wet through into the summer, there are no fish naturally occurring here. There are some fish that occur in some parts of the Santa Clara River where there's more water more of the time, and but not here. But because we're kind of up in here in the intermittent stream area where there's a lot of leaf litter into the stream, which breaks down and produces nutrients right from the decay of the leaves and the growth of fungi on the leaves and bacteria and other microbes. And then we also have some smaller organisms, like I would say right down to here, right? Lots of insects that live in the water for a short time and then fly away, right? Which is beautifully matched to the fact that the stream is here part of the year and then it's not, right? So we have a lot of aquatic insects that are not in the water all the time. Yes?
What's, maybe you're going to talk about this, but what a first order stream and a second order stream?
That's just like where they, first order stream is like where the stream first appears. And then as many of those come together, then it's a second order stream, it's bigger. And and usually that's where there's water all the time and it has fish. Right.
Is that a standard definition?
There is, but it's, I would have to look it up. Right.
We can do that too.
There is. So like a water agency or someone who does habitat delineation would know that. Okay. All right, so this is a slide that was in here that's beautifully connected to what you were talking about earlier, which is that all Placerita Creek and all streams lead to the ocean, right? That they all flow downstream to the ocean. And this is Long Beach Harbor after rain. Like the first rain of the season usually produces the most flow of garbage. So this is just the part of the garbage that floats, right? And they do put out booms to collect it because there's so much of it, right? But then there's also a lot of garbage that doesn't float, like shopping carts and stuff, and glass, bottles, other things. And I ask this question all the time in classes, like, you know, there's all this, you know, trash floating out in the Pacific Ocean. Does that have anything to do with you? And a little bit, right? Like the most common, like we do a cleanup of the trash. Actually, I find them a lot here too. If you pick up trash on the trail, and if we do a cleanup at CSUN, the most common piece of trash we find is the first little piece that you tear off, like a candy bar, a granola bar wrapper, right? If you tear it at the top and there's like this little corner comes off, right? And it's almost like people don't think that's trash, right? Because it's so small and they drop that, but maybe they put the big part of the wrapper in the trash, but that little one is everywhere, right? So something like that would float down a stream if it got in the stream. So everything we find in the creek could end up in the Pacific Ocean when it gets there. And three of the docents actually walked the Placerita stream, well, from I think Acton, walked the Santa Clara River down to the ocean.
Yeah, to answer your question, they started seeing fish around Fillmore, because in Fillmore, then there is water, little pocket, water that stayed the whole year, and it keep on going to Ventura.
How long did that hike take?
They did it in segments. I think it took a month.
Yeah,
or,
it took them a while. They
Yeah.
did segments.
Yeah.
You know, I think you can still see some of that on YouTube.
Oh,
They put it on there for a long time ago. I can't think of the title. It's like the last river in LA or LA County or something like that.
okay.
Santa Clarita, you know, whatever.
We should tie that to our.
Dig it out of there.
I may have it on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I think I recorded it, so.
Anyhow, it all goes there.
Pictures of them, these guys walking past no trespassing signs.
Anyhow, sometimes we on Ecology II walk time, we go out and walk in the creek and see what stuff we can find. Right? We have found like shoes and things.
It happens at Dockweiler too, but nowhere near that extent. But yeah, tires, even what do you call the sofa cushions, people dump everything.
I was in LA Harbor for a class. I was in LA Harbor like a week ago Friday, and we were going out in a boat and we saw something up there and we're like, you know, what is that? Is that like is it a jet ski up there? What is, you know, it's like out by itself. And is that a person on it? Is that a bird around it? Like, because it was like a seagull. And we got up there and it was a mattress floating.
It's a perfect example. You know, a few of you already approached me today. Someone dumped a piano in our entrance.
Oh,
So people literally don't. Some people really don't care. If you go to all the turnouts, we were talking about it when we went for the deer, right? You just lean over and it's trash. Like we don't see it while we're driving, but if you park and you just take a peek down, there's trash everywhere.
It was like a garbage bag right around the corner. I couldn't stop anywhere safe, but.
Have you seen the car up there, Renee, that's off the side of the hill? Yeah, every time, it's a 1970s kind of a hatchback. Every time we have a fire that blows through there, cars, that the car got me, I was afraid there might be a body inside of it. There wasn't, thank God. The brush grows over, you don't see it for a few years.
Can we go on a field trip to that?
Yeah, sure, you wanna do it?
There
When
was
they
a,
open up the canyon trail, I'll show you.
on this, where are we? The trail up here that goes around, the first time Monica took me, to do that one, once we get to the highest point and I saw the drive, Placerita Canyon, and I was like, what? There was tires, huge tires. I was like, no, that right there, like, so it's gone now. But I needed a lot of help. I had like 3 guys go with me. But yeah, it's just, it messes it up. Like you have a perfect view of nature, and you just see rubber,
Yeah, or pianos.
Yeah.
It's not even a very nice looking piano. Okay, anyhow, so yes, that. We also have runoff of dissolved things that are going to the ocean, right? So fertilizers that run off lawns, and that dissolved nutrient pollution we call eutrophication, which means true nutrition, really. And that true nutrition is like it's too much of a good thing. So it's like fertilizer that would fertilize plants running off into the ocean causes, or the freshwater streams, right, causes the photosynthetic things, plant-like things there to grow extra fast, right? It causes an algal bloom. They are, when they have like a stream that has a lot of algae in it, like this, or like our stream will look as it starts to dry out, is very efficient, according to this research study here by this person in this journal, very efficient at cleaning the water as it goes by, right, at picking up the excess nutrients. Yeah?
I thought, maybe I had it wrong, I thought eutrophication is a bad thing because I thought that it kills all the fish because it can cover the top of the water and oxygen, they don't have any more oxygen.
All true. It's a complicated thing, right? So a little bit of extra algae makes the water, makes it more efficient at cleaning the water that goes by, right? So that the nutrients are being taken out of the water and incorporated into the bodies of the algae. But if there's so much algae that it covers the surface, or that at nighttime when it's not doing photosynthesis and it's using oxygen, right, because all plants are also doing cellular respiration and they're taking up oxygen at night, that it depletes the oxygen, or when that algae breaks down, right, and the metabolism of the microbes that are decomposing it take up the oxygen, then you can have a low oxygen event or completely no oxygen at all, which they call a dead zone, because then nothing can live there that needs oxygen.
Oh, I was going to mention the decomposition thing.
Right, okay. Yeah, so it's like all integrated, right? Like, so it's like, it's like nothing in nature is absolutely bad. It's just like if there's too much of something. So, right, eutrophication is too much nutrients. And it shifts the system, and if it shifts it too far, then, right, you have this like fish kill, right, because there's not enough oxygen.
Janet, are the red tides that they talk about, is that eutrophication or is that
Yeah.
some other naturally occurring thing?
So red tides have always been occurring, occasionally,
Yeah.
but they're way more than there used to be. And in some places like the Gulf Coast of Florida, there's a lot of farm runoff into the Gulf Coast of Florida, and they have a particularly bad red tide situation there, where they actually call it Florida red tide, which is fueled by agriculture.
So is something like DDT just straight up pollution? How do we
Yeah.
categorize that?
Yes, DDT is just straight up pollution because it's used It is a compound made to kill things. And eutrophication comes from, trying to get things to grow, but specific things, and overusing fertilizers. Also, sometimes from animal waste, including human waste. Like sometimes when it rains a lot, then sewage treatment plants overflow. And like we hear about, like every year, honestly, every time it rains, some sewage treatment plants cannot handle the rainwater that comes into them, and then they release untreated water. It's kind of how they're designed to work in Southern California, amazingly. But it's because there's only rain for a short time of the year, so it's not worth making the capacity for that much water to be treated all the year. So it's like a balancing act between, do you want to pay that much more for water treatment, right? So, yeah. So like Malibu Creek is a place where there's often some extra discharge of rainwater mixed with untreated water. Okay, so yeah, this is just the point that it can sometimes be a good thing, and if you see the algae, it's not always a problem, but if they're persistently stream covered with algae, it can indicate a problem. So this Southern California Coastal Water Research Project does a lot of monitoring of streams in Southern California and coastal water, and looking for what's in the stream and whether it's too much of a good thing, right? So this example here, where like all the water surface in an intermittent stream, like our stream would look like much of the year, is covered with green algae, right? There's no open water, right? That would be a problematic green bloom. And if you looked at that microscopically, it would look like this at low magnification and this at higher magnification. They're beautiful. Right? And, they're just responding to what's in the environment. So their website is a great source for more information about streams and stream ecology. And here are some of the really cool things that you could find in our stream some of the time. Lots of them are only present during some stages, right? Like this is divided into like flow intermittence, so like, not very intermittent to very intermittent, and whether it's in the flowing water stage, like it will be later in the spring, or in the stage when there are pools on the side. Many of these creatures you see here, like these little aquatic snails and many kinds of worms and these kinds of beetles down here, we used to see fairly often. I hope we'll see some this year. And with that, I want to stop talking about this. And normally I would say, let's go look in the stream, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to look in this box. And we're going to look at this stream water well, it's not stream water, it's pond water. But down in the pond, so